Thank you very much. I'm very pleased and honored to be here with you. Thanks to PerkinElmer. It's my very first time in China, and I'm impressed by your beautiful country of yours. I come from a city in the northeast of Italy where we run newborn screening for congenital hypothyroidism, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and galactosemia, and glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenases, and biotin deficiency, and cystic fibrosis, and tandem mass spectrometry with the extended newborn screening. I'm here with you today because I want to practice a little bit with you how to set up a cutoff for newborn screening. And they asked me to take a couple of examples, one for congenital hypothyroidism, and the biochemical marker for that is TSH, and the other example is the glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenases deficiency, and this is the second example. We run both of them in GSP instrumentations since 2015. Okay, I kept the presentation with a practical cut, let's say, a very practical approach, and this is because I want you to take home the message of playing with your cutoff. What does it mean? It means you have to calculate it over and over again, your cutoffs. There has to be practical day-to-day work in your lab workflow, because see, cutoffs has to be monitored because the risk is to miss some babies. And your mission is to identify potentially affected newborns. And the evaluation of your cutoff is the main tool that allows you to fulfill the requirement of identified affected babies. Okay? So let's start. There's something wrong with it? Okay, I got it. Okay, so right before setting the cutoff, we have to make some consideration. There are some points to ponder about it. First of all, we have to be well aware of the pathophysiological role of the biochemical markers in the disease. And I give you an example, straightforward. The TSH will be an hallmark for hypothyroidism in the higher range, okay? Whereas the G6PD will be a hallmark for enzymatic deficiency in the lower range. So you have to be well aware of this, because you have to focus your attention on the range of values which are hallmark for the disease. And then we have to be well aware of the frequency distribution of your biochemical markers. And this is because you have to use the appropriate tools, statistical tools, in order to calculate your cutoffs. And as you might already know, there are different statistical methods that you can use. Depends on how your marker is distributed among the general population. That is, it can display a symmetrical distribution. So in this case, you can use statistics like standard deviations, or you may talk about median, or stuff like that. But if it's not symmetrically distributed, as in our cases, you have to use non-parametric statistics, that is percentile, okay? That's why you hear about percentiles so many times, because most of the times the markers that you are dealing with displays a non-symmetrical distribution among the general population. And then There's another point to ponder just before starting. The prevalence of the disease among the general population. Why this? Because it gives us the magnitude of the recall rate. That is, how many babies do I have to recall in order to make sure to identify as many as possible affected babies, okay? I give you an example. If your disease is extremely common, like let's say 3% of the population is affected, if you have a recall rate of 1, you're going to miss many cases, okay? This is the message. And then, well, there's another step that refers to the adjustment of your cutoff on the basis of the performance of your kids, the precision of your kids. And I give you an example right away. If you have a spot spiked like 10 microunit per milliliter of TSH, and you measure the TSH several times, the same spots, you don't get 10 all over the times. You might get 9.9 and then 10.3, okay? And you cannot neglect those values around your cutoff. How to take into account of those. And I'll show you one of the possible methods to do that. Last but not least, you have to look at the literature and see if there is some specific protocol for specific categories of newborns. And the classical example is the TSH. Why? Because you see the TSH needs, in order to identify hypothyroidism newborns which was born with a low birth weight or maybe preterms, the spot takes at birth sometimes turns out to be negative, and you have to recollect another samples, maybe at least 2 weeks of life, more 3 or 4. And this is the protocols that you have to apply. Okay, let's go. If I translate the previous slide in the 2 examples that we have to talk about today, that would look just a little bit like this. The TSH is a hallmark of the disease in the higher range, whereas the G6PD in the lower range. They both display known parametric distribution, asymmetrical distribution among the general population. So we will talk about percentiles and forget about standard deviation of statistics like that, parametric statistics. The congenital hypothyroidism is quite rare compared to the G6PD, which is quite common. And both has to be adjusted, both the cutoff has to be adjusted for the precisions of the test. And you'll see we'll talk about a specific protocol only for congenital hypothyroidism in case of preterms baby and low birth weight newborns. Okay, as you know, the TSH is produced by the pituitary upon a stimulus, hypothalamic stimulus, which is the TRH. And the TSH prompts the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones, okay? The thyroid hormones act as a feedback both at the level of the hypothalamus and the pituitary, okay? If something's go wrong, if the thyroid hormones are low in the blood, in the circulation, this prompts the pituitary to produce a lot of TSH. That's why the TSH in the higher range is hallmark for the hypothyroid status. Okay, this is the kit we are using, and then we run almost 100,000 newborns, and it's based on the sandwich principle. That means the TSH, which is right here, is packed between two antibodies. And at the end of the procedures, the fluorescence is proportional to the amount of TSH present in the samples. And this is a typical layout from GSP. You might already know by this time. As you can see, the concentration of DSH goes up just like the fluorescence. And the linear proportionality is well visible in the plot right here. Okay, so let's start. Let's say that we have to set the cutoff for congenital hypothyroidism. What do you have to do? The first thing that you have to do is collect at least 2,000 samples, and I say at least because there's statistical method that tells you exactly how many samples you have to collect in order to have sufficient power. But let's say that 2,000 are okay. Of course, you have to collect according to the manual, the instruction manual, and I recommend you to collect when the baby is at least 36 hours of life, okay? If you measure your 2,000 samples, you end up having a distribution much similar to this. This is our data that comes from almost 90,000 samples. And as you can appreciate, the distribution is not symmetrical. And because we are lucky, we have to work on this side of the curve, exactly where the hypothyroid subjects are. So see, there's a lot of values among the general population that overlaps the range where we will find our hypothyroid newborns. And this is another way of telling the same thing. This is the confirmed hypothyroid, and this is the healthy population. So these slides tell us two things, a good one and a bad one. The good one is there are several hypothyroid newborns that display TSH value very different from the normal population, and this is the good one. The bad one is that several hypothyroid newborns display TSH values overlapping, I would say, the one that you find in the normal population. Remember what Tony told you about the two curves? They are overlapping. This is the case, okay? So we have to reach a compromise between the need to identify all the hypothyroid newborns and the constraints in keeping the recall rate as low as possible. In this view, prevalence of the disease can help us. Remember the example that I told you before? We have to keep the recall rate higher compared to the prevalence, of course, otherwise we're going to miss the cases. And, well, I keep doing this. Okay, sorry. Okay. In Italy, the congenital hypothyroidism ranges from 1 out of 3,200 to 1 out of 2,300, which is quite common, but it's rare compared to the enzymatic deficiency of G6PD. I would say quite rare. What about in China? In China, it depends. I look at the literature, and it depends a lot about the ethnic groups. But anyway, if you find that you have a prevalence just like ours in Europe, I would say. So this tells us to think about, well, start to think about the recall rate, which has to be, in this case, less than 1%, even far less than that, to reach the compromise that I've been telling you. So, okay, let's say that we want to start like recalling one baby every 200, okay? And if you think about it, if I want to recall one baby every 200, that means that I have to work with the 99.5th percentiles. Is that clear for everyone? And just make sure this is clear, okay? Because what comes afterwards is kind of easy and straightforward, because any application that you use, like Excel or SPSS or Stata, gives the 99.5th percentile of your 2,000 samples, okay? So what you have to do is to input the 2,000 TSH that you find in your 2,000 samples and ask the application to give you the 99.5th percentile. And this is what we found, 11. This is our cutoff. You have to calculate your own, which I don't think will be much different from that, but that you have to calculate your own. Now take the one in literature, or maybe somewhere. This is the cutoff, okay? So, as I mentioned you, if I set the cutoff at 11, I cannot neglect the values around that 11 and how to take into account that variation. There are several methods, and I suggest you to perform this one. Okay, it's quite easy because you spot a couple of samples with the TSH level close to the calculated cutoff. Okay, you can make a pool of blood donors, or maybe use the QC that you find in the kit, of course, if it is close to the calculated cutoff. And make sure to have enough blood to spot at least 15 spots, because you have to measure the same samples all over again, okay, in different situations. And I mean different plates, different batch, different working days, and different kit locks, in order to take into account all the possible factors that produce variability in your lab settings, okay? So you end up having two series of values, one for the first sample and one for the second one, and you're gonna calculate the standard deviation for each of those two samples. And you might already know the standard deviation is the square root of the sum of the square distances from the mean divided by the numerosity minus 1. But any application that you use will tell you the standard deviation for your sample. And then you choose the highest standard deviation between the two, in order to make sure to take into account the maximum variation that you're dealing with, okay? And what do? You double your maximum standard deviation, and make sure to understand this, you subtract this value from the calculated cutoff, okay? Why do you have to subtract it? Because we need to pay attention to the higher range of TSH. So in order to make sure to keep, okay, this is the cutoff for my samples, and this is what I've just calculated. Twice the standard deviation on this direction, because we make sure to pick up these values as well, because all the values obtained around the cutoff has to be taken into account. This is already taken into account from the cutoff setting. And this is what we call, and let me go back, okay, the retest, okay? So far, we calculated two values, the cutoff and the retest. How to use them all? And this is the algorithm for the recalling that we use in our lab. Those are the two levels that we set, the retest and the cutoff. And it works this way. If the TSH, the first TSH that we measured on the sample, exceeds the retest level, in this case, the same sample has to be retested in duplicate. That means you end up having 3 values for the same sample. One coming from the very first measurement, and the second from the 2 measurements made in duplicate. Okay? So this is the rule that we apply. The baby will be recalled if 2 values out of 3 exceeds our cutoff. In that case, the baby will be recalled for diagnostic procedures. Otherwise, the babies will be considered healthy, negative. Okay? This is the algorithm to apply the retest and the cutoff levels. This is what I just showed you. This is the visual scenario that I just talked about. Okay, as I told you, in case of preterm baby and low birth newborns, the feedback that I was showing you at the beginning sometimes is not mature enough to raise the TSH in case of hypothyroidism at birth. You have to wait at least a couple of weeks in order to assure time necessary to raise the TSH in those babies where the feedback is immature, okay? And there are several guidelines that tells you how to proceed in these cases. But to make the things simple, you have to collect another samples from those babies at least 2 weeks of life, okay? So it may happen that preterm baby, they show negative result at birth, but then at 2 weeks of age, you find a TSH very high because the feedbacks needed more time to get mature and to respond to an hypothyroidism condition, okay? So this is what happened in Italy when we applied the protocols for newborn babies. Well, this is the incidence of the congenital hypothyroidism, and it raised over time. We lower our cutoffs over time, but we introduced the special protocol as well. So you can, if you don't implement the special protocol, you might miss a lot of babies, hypothyroidism babies, okay? Okay, now the procedure is just the same. The difference is that you will collect 2,000 samples from preterms and low birth weight, okay? So those are the samples, the starting samples, and I would suggest a percentile of 99.7 in order to set up the cutoff for these late samples, the one collected at 2 weeks of life. But you can choose your own based on literature. You can get some suggestion from literature. And what I've got in my lab, I got a value of 5 as a cutoff for these samples taken at 2 weeks of life. And then do the same procedure because your test can have a variability different from the samples taken at birth. So you have to, again, spot a couple of samples close to the cutoff calculated and find out the standard deviation. Again, the double of the maximum standard deviation has to be subtracted from the cutoff in order to find your retest. This is a focus on distribution around the cutoff and the retest for those little babies. We have 10,000 preterm, but you'll find something very similar, I guess. Okay. This is just quality control that I recommend you to participate. We use the one issued by CDC, but there's so many. And we might skip to the glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency. Okay, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase is an enzyme that protects erythrocytes against oxidative injury, and it's particularly important in erythrocytes because unlike other cells, red cells, they only have this enzyme to keep their inner environment in the reduced state, okay? So this is pathophysiological mechanism. And the deficiencies is quite common because it confers a sort of protective role to the one that bears the mutated enzyme, because it confers a protective role against malaria. There's a very nice paper I found here, and it's your colleague, Chinese colleagues. As you can see, the deficiency of glucose 6-phosphate is quite common, especially in the areas among the between the two tropics, because of the protective role against malaria. In China, again, it's quite dependent on the ethnic group that you are dealing with, but I would say it's extremely common. We have in Italy a little bit lower value, but it is considered a quite common disease in Italy as well. Okay, let me give you a couple of information about the genetic transmission of the deficiencies, because it will turn out useful later on. G6PD is encoded by a gene located on the X chromosome, and as you know, the X chromosome are sex chromosome. That is, females bears 2 X chromosomes, whereas males bear a single chromosome X and a Y chromosome. To make things simple, males, in case of the glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenases, can be healthy if they bear the X healthy allele gene, or affected if they bear the X chromosome mutated, okay? Females can be healthy if they bear both the chromosome healthy, or affected if they bear both the chromosome mutated. Or, there's a third case in case of female, they can be carrier. In this case, they bear a mutated X and a wild type, that is healthy allele. And those carriers are particularly interesting, and I'll show you later why. But just before that, let me add a couple information about the embryonic development, and later on another X inactivation that I'll tell you. Okay, during embryonic development of a female subject, a random X inactivation occurs. What that means? It means that in females, one of these 2 chromosomes becomes inactivated randomly across the body, okay? So the females end up being like a patchwork, okay? A mosaic of several cell lines, each displaying one of the 2 chromosomes inactivated and the other one activated, okay? But this is not the end of the story, because after that, in case of the enzymatic deficiency that we are talking about, if you remember, I told you that the erythrocytes are particularly sensitive to oxidative stress. That means that these cells in the female carrier, that display the mutated allele, they get destroyed. There's a sort of survival of the best fit, as you can find in the selection, okay? So all the story, to make the story short, you have to be particularly careful in case of carrier female, the very first time of their life. Because with age, in carrier woman, the G6PD activity will increase because the cell lines that will remain, they will display the non-mutated allele. So it's the very first few times of life for carrier men that they can go, they can be a clinical issue, because that means to incur in hemolysis, okay, episodes in case of drug administration, particular drugs administration. So you have to be careful when you do newborn screening. If it's possible to spot these female carriers, it's a good thing for the clinician, okay? So this is the kit run on GSP, and we run so far 63,000. And again, we have a fluorescence signal proportional to the enzymatic activity. So the calibration curves looks just like this. There's an increase in fluorescence that correlates with the concentration of G6PD, and this is the layout, the graphical layout. So proceed just as we've been telling you, 2,000 samples, and run on GSP all your 2,000 samples, and calculate the percentile, take into account the prevalence of your disease, and adjust the cutoff, and set the algorithm for the recalling. We already go through this. It's the same method, just apply it in another screening. Okay, when you dose your 2,000 sample, you end up having something very much similar like this. Again, we are quite unlucky because see the tail of the population, of the distribution in the general population overlaps exactly the range where we look for deficiency. Okay, we started and we set the third percentile as a cutoff, and you calculate your own with 2,000 samples that you calculate, and we end up having 26 as a cutoff, and it's set right here. Then go ahead, adjust your cutoff based on the variability of your test. It is just like we've just mentioned for the TSH, but make sure in this time to add your variability to the cutoff. Remember, in case of TSH, we subtracted because we were interested in the higher range of TSH. In this case, we are interested in the low range because it's enzymatic deficiency. So to make sure to collect all the samples around this area here, oh, this is not, okay. This is the percentile 26, okay, right here. And this is our reset, which is retest level, which is 30 and comes right here. And just to make sure that you see that we catch these babies right here, okay? And the algorithm for the recalling is just, it looks like the TSH as we already see. Just make attention to the operator. In this case, they are opposite, okay? The GSPD has to be low. Okay, thank you. The GSPD value require to retest and duplicate the same sample when it's low compared to the retest level. And then again, if 2 values out of 3 are low compared to the cutoff, that in this case, the newborn will be recalled, okay? Okay, just to show you the cutoff and the recall, the cutoff and the retest, the recall in the 2 populations, male and female. And see, the majority are males because those are total deficients. And we have a very few females, and those right here are the carrier that I was telling you about. We are now following them and see if they can incur to hemolysis episodes in case of drugs administration or in oxidative injury. Okay, and this is just to remind you to participate to the quality control. And this is a very point that I want to show you. We used to use a qualitative test, and then we moved to the GSP. And just to make very simple, if you see right here, we test the same population with the 2 methods, and with the qualitative test, we missed completely the female carriers, whereas with the GSP, we spot them all. And this is very interesting if you have to look after those little babies. Just keep that one. Oh, remember, I mentioned I had a very practical approach, but there's a lot of theory that you have to look at, and you might go a little bit deeper on the topic, and I suggest a couple of works, a couple of books right here. So thank you for your attention.